Moving from the theoretical to the practical can sometimes be a hard kind of bridge to cross, especially in software engineering, because you can read about theory and you can read about theoretical concepts, but it's hard to sometimes visualize that, and sometimes it's hard, especially when you're just starting out, to take what you're reading and really apply it to like practical, a practical understanding of what's happening. An example of this is when we're talking about distributed systems. So if you have a web service, let's say we have our two-stroke engine service running on multiple hosts. How do we visualize that or think about that conceptually? And what happens if those services need to share, are trying to access a shared database instance? What happens if both of those services try to access the same record in a database? How is that going to be handled? And I think it's things like that we have to try to bridge the gap between theory and the theoretical and in the practical. Another example is when we're talking about queuing technologies. So RabbitMQ, if you have, let's say, a single Rabbit server running, and then you have multiple hosts of our two-stroke engine service running in the background, and those are both registered as consumers of a queue on a RabbitMQ server. Well, what happens? RabbitMQ operates under the strategy of basically whoever gets it first gets it, right. And if service A gets it first, service B is not going to get the same message. So I forget what it's actually called. Like, what's the word? The first competing consumer strategy is how it's set up by default, at least with mass transit. But it's those kind of things that's hard to move from the theoretical to the practical, because if you're going to set this up locally, you have to have some kind of virtual machine running with your instance or with your service on your machine. Then you have to have on your local host machine another instance of that service running, and then you have to have your RabbitMQ server running on the background, and then you have to then feed data into it and then watch and see which of the services consumes that message off the queue. And it's those kind of things I think that can be challenging to think about, right? Because now you've taken it from just basically a one-dimensional understanding of an application running and how it accesses resources and how it communicates outside, to the database and the queues. Now you've made it basically, you've added a whole nother layer to that, because now you've now distributed it. So now you have to worry about competing consumers. Now you have to worry about shared access to database records. How are we going to handle the locks? How are we going to handle caching strategies? How are we going to handle, failover? Now we have to have a load balancer. Now we have to have it adds so much to the conversation that I think if you're just starting out, whenever you add that layer of multiple hosts, or in the context of distributed systems, it can be overwhelming, and it can make learning this stuff a very daunting task, especially when you're reading a book. You're like, oh yeah, okay, now I'm learning how to make a .NET web API. Now I'm learning the CRUD operations. Now I'm learning how to serve a front end. Now I've learned how to access a database and all the stuff that goes along with it. That's generally all thought about or assumed to be running on a single host. So whenever you introduce another host into this, now you have to think about it a layer deeper. Now you have to think about, okay, what does all that look like that we just mentioned? And that can be challenging. And honestly, again, I think that we run up into the problem of finding good quality content to guide us through these topics. And it's challenging. It's challenging too to replicate all this stuff, because there's just so much you have to set up locally to get all this running. Like, and especially when you're just starting out, like, I know for me, when I started, I wouldn't have known. I didn't know how to use Docker. I didn't know how to use Docker Compose to start all these things up, and I didn't know that. I was not even thinking about running my you know, project on multiple hosts. I wasn't thinking about scalability. I wasn't thinking about horizontal scaling at the time. I just that wasn't even on my radar. But it's part of the conversation in software engineering. It's just that sometimes I think it's hard to go from the theoretical understanding of all that to the practical. And I think that especially when we are reading books about .NET and programming and all these things, scalability is just a tricky one to cover because where are you going to introduce scalability? Do you introduce it at the end after you've covered all the single host topics, or are you going to bring it up in the middle of everything when you're talking about database access? Or are you going to talk about it when you're setting up like the front end? I mean, when are you going to bring it up? So it's a hard topic because it's almost its own book in and of itself, but it needs to be, I really think it needs to be like a two-part series. I think it needs to be, you have your first part, and your first part is building up your back end API and your front end, and then setting up the database and setting up the RabbitMQ server. That can all be part of book one, but I think there needs to be a part two, a book two, and the book two is making your book one scalable, and it's taking your whole system and it's going to be, okay, what happens if we distribute out our API into multiple hosts? How do we have to do that? Are we going to then scale the database? How do we handle replication? How do we handle the consistency of data? Are we going to scale our RabbitMQ server, and are we going to make it a cluster of RabbitMQ nodes? How are we going to handle shoveling? How are we going to handle federation of the data? I mean, there's just so many things that we have to then think about, and it's hard. And I really think that if we put together a two-part series where we just did part one and then part two, what we just talked about, I think it would be helpful. I think it could really be something, because I know from when I'm again, this is mainly stemming from like where I started and like the difficulties I have still and had, especially when I started. If this would have been helpful for me, and because it's hard to find documentation around this, because it's often very specific. It's often like it's so because we can talk about it. Sure, we can talk about, oh yeah, you just scale it horizontally. That's often where the conversation stops. Is like, oh, okay, we have we talk about vertical and horizontal scaling, right? We talk about, oh, vertical scaling, okay, we can up the memory, we can up the CPU, we can up the instance size. We got all that. We can cover that in part one of the book about, okay, when we set these instances up originally. But once we talk about horizontal scaling, make it actual distributed system, then it becomes complicated. Then we got to get serious about, okay, how are we actually going to configure this? How are we going to configure our load balancer? How are we going to access both of these running two-stroke engine services that we have now in the background? How are we going to access? How are we going to distribute out a MySQL instance, that we have running locally now? How are we going to distribute that out locally on a local machine? That's the part that's hard, because you don't want to go and pay, right, to have this made. That gets expensive real quick, and you're not going to want to set that up, especially when you're just trying to learn this locally. It's best to get it all running on your machine. That way you have total control over everything that happens and have a fundamental understanding of what really is happening when we scale these horizontally. And it's hard, and I think the amount of configuration it takes and the amount of time it just kind of takes to set that up locally, I think is really why horizontal scaling is covered in depth on a practical level, because it does take a lot of work. In some places, it's a whole team that is responsible for that. So if you've now placed the burden on that yourself, I completely understand why it's just not, maybe not as covered as vertical scaling. And it's challenging, right? Because not only are you trying to make now this distributed system, but you're now trying to basically experience all the problems that come along with it. You're trying to replicate race conditions. You're trying to replicate deadlocks to see what happens. You're trying to play around with uh, distributed locking in the database. You're trying to do all these things, and it's just time. It comes down to time, and the configuration can be a real burden, because it's a lot more configuration than just having a single host talking to your local MySQL database and your local RabbitMQ server. And it's hard to it's challenging. So I'm thinking about the context of this channel, and I need to look up a good way to just get a virtual machine running locally and have that running another instance of my application. Because I think if I'm able to get a virtual machine running, I should be able to get enough time to do configuration to get some of these stuff set up, but we'll see. I really want to do a scaling series. I think that would be really cool. But again, it's a lot. It'd be a bit of setup. So I'd like to do it next year. I really like to do a scaling series and just again continue to tack that onto our two-stroke engine project, because I think it'd be really well. One, I kind of want to do it myself just so I can have a better understanding of all that. But I think it'd be interesting. I think the content would really be. I think it'd be helpful and interesting. So yeah, we'll see. We'll see where we get on that. But I think that to me is one of the main reasons why it's hard to move sometimes from the theoretical to the practical, because of the amount of time it takes to set some of this up, the amount of kind of administrative overhead that you yourself have to go through to get everything set up. But again, just it's a lot of it's configuration, and a lot of it is just configuration for not much payoff locally, right? You're not going to get any. There's not going to be any gain to you setting this up locally. Horizontally scaling something for a personal project doesn't make any sense unless you're just trying to learn. So that's why it's hard, I think. That's why I think finding content that's practical on it is quite difficult outside of like the enterprise level. Oh yeah, if you have if you want to pay to make this stuff on the cloud, go for it. But yeah, it's I personally don't want to do that. I don't. I don't. Not trying to do that right now. So, but I think that's those reasons. I think is why it's harder. So, if you have any ideas of how we could make a scalability series, let me know, because I'm trying to think through our kind of roadmap for next year in terms of like the technical series that we're going to try to do. So, yeah, I'm trying to be thinking through that. I'll probably post something on that here. But yeah, that's all I got. So I'll see you in the next one.